Hi everybody, I'm Mike McCrory and this is Would You Make It? I have a craft sale coming up in a few days and I've been busy making some cutting boards and serving trays and a few other things. And you may have already seen the elliptical serving tray that I made just a few days ago. In fact, I'm still wearing the same t-shirt. So what I want to make next is a brick style cutting board. Here's one that I've made out of walnut, maple, and cherry. And I want to make one like this and maybe a couple like this, smaller versions. This is not something that I invented. There's plenty of information on YouTube and on the internet about how to make these. So I thought the focus of this video would be less about how to make it, the step-by-step process, and more about what can go wrong. And I'll incorporate some of the lessons that I've learned through multiple iterations of making these things and show you what can go wrong and what you can do to avoid the problems and end up with a better product. So let's get started.
I'll start by flattening the walnut boards on one side by running it through the jointer multiple times. And then I'll joint one of the edges so that I can run it through the table saw later. And then I'll plane it down to the desired thickness. Now, one thing to note about the thickness of the wood is the thicker you make it, the fewer number of pieces you'll need to make the desired length of the cutting board. So if the walnut is thick, then the walnut strips that I'm about to cut don't have to be nearly as long. It's really a design choice because what I've found is the thinner the wood, the nicer the look, because it looks a little bit more refined. If it's thicker walnut, then the bricks are a little bit heavier and a little chunkier looking. And here's an example of what I mean. You can see the thinner bricks compared to the thicker bricks. Now, I've seen some guys on YouTube make cutting boards like this, and they cut the walnut strips to be all the same width. But you really don't need to do that with the last strip. It needs to be half the width of all the other ones. Otherwise, you're going to end up cutting off a lot of waste. Now I'm cutting the cherry, and I have the bandsaw fence set to cut about 1/4 of an inch strip. And then I'll run it through the drum sander to remove the sawtooth marks and get all the strips to a uniform thickness. Now, when I was planing the walnut, I also planed the cherry so that these strips would be the same thickness as the walnut strips. And that's important when it comes to clamping. Now, just before gluing up, it's helpful to have everything laid out so that it's handy when needed. So I've got some cauls, some wax paper, some Titebond 3 glue, clamps, and a bucket of water with some rags so that I can wipe up the squeeze out. And now I'll apply a liberal amount of glue. Now, one of the things I learned is the importance of having the cherry strips to be the same thickness as the walnut strips, and that really eases the clamping so you can get a nice flat piece. When I made my first brick style cutting board, I used cherry strips that were thicker than the walnut, thinking that I would just plane off the excess after it was glued. But it makes it really difficult to ensure that everything is lined up properly and that the boards are flat. And that just results in excess waste when you go to plane it up. It's really a good idea to use cauls like this going across the wood to hold everything flat, to keep the cherry strips lined up with the walnut strips. And that's the benefit of having the same thickness. It's a good idea to use wax paper to prevent the cauls from sticking to the wood. If you forget to do that, you can still get them off with a little bit of effort, but it's a lot easier if you've used the wax paper. So I'll let that sit overnight, and while that glue is curing, I will work on the maple strips. So I'm going to take these two boards, which are the equivalent of the width of the cutting board, and I'll glue them together. Use cauls again to make sure it remains flat, and then I'll let that sit overnight as well. Now it's the next day and the glue has cured, so I will run the first glue up through the planer. And the maple piece that I had glued up is a little bit wider than the cutting board, and it was too wide to go through the planer, so I used the drum sander instead. So now I'm setting up my crosscut sled with a stop block to cut strips that are about 1 3/4 inches. My goal is to end up with a cutting board that it's at least 1.5 inches thick. So this is probably not the safest practice that I'm employing right now, to lift up the strip while the blade is turning, but I feel like I've done this enough times that I can do it fairly safely. But there is a risk. If I ever drop the piece onto the blade, it would, first of all, it would destroy the piece and it would kick back toward me. So you need to be very careful. And it's a little bit tedious to turn off the blade each time, especially because I'm cutting so many strips. But I do recommend that you turn off the blade. When you get to the last pieces, it starts to become unsafe to use the crosscut sled. You're better off using the regular fence on the table saw because you just have a little bit of material left. And so what I've done here is I've used one of the strips that I've cut already to set up the fence to be the right distance away from the blade. Now, just like the cherry strips, I want the maple strips to be the same thickness as the walnut, as the cutting board. So I'm keeping the fence set up the way that it was, and I'm cutting the maple strips now. And I made the same mistake with my first brick style cutting board, where I made the strips a little bit thicker, thinking that that would be better to have some excess and then plane it off later or sand it off later. But it's even more important for the second glue up to make sure that everything is absolutely flat. And so that's one of the most important lessons I've learned, is to make sure that all of the strips are the same thickness. Another mistake that I made with my first brick style cutting board is I used edge grain for the strips for the maple. There's a great temptation to do that because it's a lot easier. You don't have that intermediate step where you have to glue up the pieces and then cut strips like I'm doing here on the bandsaw. But it really makes a big difference, because if you don't have all the grain running in the same direction, then you will have different rates of expansion and contraction, and you'll start to feel ridges on the surface of the cutting board. It'll feel perfect when you start, but after a week or so, you'll start to feel the ridges. The maple that I'm using is thick enough to cut 3 strips from each piece. Each one is a little bit less than 1/4 inch. And then, just like the cherry, I'll run the maple strips through the drum sander to remove the sawtooth marks and to get a uniform thickness for all of the strips. Now it's time to glue up, and while you're doing this, or even before you do this, it's important to make sure that all the boards are oriented in the right direction, so you have them alternating. Because once you glue this up, and if you've made a mistake, there's really no way to correct it other than cutting a piece out and gluing it up again. And here I'm making 3 cutting boards, 2 small ones and 1 large one. So I'm putting them all together when I'm clamping them up. It's important to check that everything's square. Put some wax paper on top because I want to put a board across the top to hold it down and make sure that it's flat. It's really important to have this step glued up completely flat. If not, your cutting boards are going to wobble, or they're going to be a little bit warped. And because it's end grain, it's really hard to straighten that out. It's not easy to plane down the end grain. And I did have a bad experience once when I made cutting boards like this, some small ones, and they ended up to be completely warped, and I had to waste a lot of material to flatten them out. Now, glue is one of the worst things for the sanding belt on a drum sander, so I'm using my random orbit sander first to clean up some of the glue. And then with my crosscut sled, I'll just trim up the edges of the cutting board. Now, the bottom of the cutting board is pretty much flat. Maybe not 100% perfect, but pretty close. So I'm running the top through the drum sander to clean up the glue and to level out any imperfections. I've found that our kitchen countertop is the best way to see if something is flat. And you can see there's a little bit of a flex there. So I'm going to just sand down the 2 high corners using the belt sander. And then I ran it through the drum sander, although I didn't video that. And now I have a few imperfections that I want to fill with epoxy, and I will let it set overnight. Now it's the next day, and I want to sand the epoxy and actually the entire cutting board, top and bottom, and the sides. And I want to do pretty much all of the sanding on top and bottom and around the sides before I run it through the round over bit on the router table. And here I'll just round over all the edges. And then with the fence and stop blocks in place, I'm going to use a round nose bit. I think it's a 3/8 inch round nose bit to cut a groove, a little finger slot in each end. You just need to hold the board securely while you're moving it across the fence. And I always like to turn the bit off before I lift it up. You can lift it up if you lift it straight up while the bit is turning, but there's a risk that you could damage the finger slot. And then I turn it end for end, keeping the same side against the fence. That way, if your router bit is not perfectly dead center, then you'll be consistently off center on each end. Like I do with all my cutting boards before applying the finish, I took them to the kitchen sink and wet them to raise the grain, let it dry, sanded it with 220 grit sandpaper. Then I wet them again, and now I'm doing a final sanding. This helps to get a really smooth finish that will last. And now here's the part we've all been waiting for. Now, since I've used water to raise the grain and sanded it before applying the cutting board oil, I won't have to sand it after I apply this. And it makes it a lot easier because it's very difficult to sand it once you've applied the oil. And this will give an ultra smooth finish that you'll be really happy with. And there's the final product. So I gotta ask, would you make it?